In education, certainly in public education, there's an increasing focus on accountability and therefore on the quality of what's being provided. In this respect, public education is being treated like other public services and is subject to what is called the new public management policy, a results-based approach under which government places a greater focus on what it's getting for its money. But how is it to impose accountability and in particular to assess the quality of what is provided in the schools and universities? The answer generally is to create performance indicators, and the quality of those institutions is judged according to the extent by which they meet these indicators. That's a simple but necessarily crude mechanism for accountability. The more general the indicators, the less sensitive they can be to the differences between institutions. For example, if an institution is simply stated in terms of the number of passes achieved in public examinations, then obviously a school or university that's located in an area where there's greater deprivation, and therefore less educational capital, won't perform as well as it should, according to those indicators. The more that indicators can take account of the specific circumstances of each institution, then the more meaningful those institutions are likely to be. But on the other hand, the more complex they're likely to be, and arguably less transparent. And politicians, above all, like simplicity. That's not to say that indicators don't have their place and can't be valuable, but their limitations need to be acknowledged, and the effort needs to be made to make them more meaningful. In my past life, I chaired the group which developed performance indicators for British universities. We developed a small number of key indicators which would apply to all universities. But critically, we also developed for each university a benchmark figure against which that university should be judged. The comparison should not be with an arbitrary absolute figure applied to all universities, regardless of their circumstances, nor should it be against other individual universities. Rather, the comparison should be against what it's reasonable to expect of any particular university given its circumstances and characteristics. Indicators that are sensitive like that can be meaningful. Indicators that are simply general cannot. But of course, the key danger with indicators, as the principal method for enforcing accountability, is that if an institution is to be judged by indicators, it will modify its behaviour and prioritise those things that the indicators measure, especially if you use indicators to determine the funding that universities and schools receive. Indicators should measure what's important, but the risk is that institutions will regard as important the things that are measured, which may not be what are really important. That's very clearly seen in England today, and I apologise for repeatedly using examples from England, but that's the system that I know the best, although I've worked with many other systems around the world. In England, a key indicator, actually the key indicator used by the government to measure the success of universities, is the salaries that their graduates earn after they've graduated. Really, that's so. I know it's extraordinary, but it's true. That's wrong in my view for many reasons, most particularly because universities have a far wider remit than simply preparing their graduates for the best paid employment that they can get. It completely ignores all the other things that universities do, which I'll discuss later. And beyond that, universities, of course, have other roles. Besides educating students, they can be cultural beacons in their societies. They can and they do provide valuable community service. And of course, they undertake research. Research is especially problematic. Historically, and still today, universities are very largely judged on the basis of their research, and academic staff are certainly very, very motivated to undertake research for their advancement, because promotions are very largely based on research performance and progress to professorships, almost exclusively so. Unfortunately, that provides a strong incentive for universities and their staff to focus on research, whereas arguably the most valuable function of universities in any country is to advance the human capital of its population and educate future generations to the maximum possible. And although I've focused in what I've said on universities, the same issues apply in schools as well, where indicators, as I've said, tend to be in terms of success of pupils in public examinations, how many get to university and so on. My wife, who was a primary school teacher, tells sadly how many things changed during her career, whereas at the start there was a focus not only on academic process, but also on socialization, creativity and so on. But all that had very largely gone by the end of her career, when the focus was almost exclusively on basic academic progress. Another example of how indicators can impact behaviour, and not for the better, is provided by academic university rankings. I'm thinking of those provided by the Times Higher, QS, and the academic rankings of world universities provided by Shanghai Jiao Tong University. Because the only indicators that enable comparison to be made between universities in different countries are indicators of research and research performance, where things like citations and publications are reasonably well established and so do allow international comparisons. Their rankings are based, therefore, almost exclusively on indicators that measure research prowess. The only way of improving your performance in these rankings is to improve your performance in research. Now, although the producers of these rankings claim that things like staff-to-student ratios are indicators of education, at least education inputs, if not performance, even that's not true. Because, of course, the more research a university does, the more staff it will employ, and where the number of staff is divided by the number of students to produce staff-to-student ratio, then those universities that do the most research achieve the highest rankings. And so universities that think it's important to perform well in these academic rankings are bound to focus on research at the expense of teaching, which is often the exact opposite of what a country needs. And the other thing that I'd say in this regard is that because of the narrow focus of the rankings, whatever the organisations that do the ranking might say, there may be some extremely good universities around the world that do an astounding job educating their students and perform an invaluable service to their countries, but which never appear in the rankings and which are never acknowledged to do such an outstanding job. Students have no way of knowing all that, and so all too often will base their choices of university, especially if they're looking to go to university in another country, on these rankings that tell them nothing about the quality of the education that they're likely to receive. And so the lesson I draw from all of this is that we have to be careful and sensitive in judging and comparing education institutions. The risk is that we will adopt crude measures because those are the only measures that are available, and even the wrong measures leading universities and schools to pursue activities that are measured and ignore activities which may be more valuable but which are not measured.